The evening wind rolled softly through the desert, carrying with it the dry scent of sagebrush and dust. The sun hung low behind the mountains, bleeding its last orange light across the wide Apache plains. The air shimmered faintly, and somewhere far off, a hawk cried over the dying day. In that lonely stretch of land between the known and the wild, a young woman stumbled through the sand, her torn dress clinging to her in patches of dirt and sweat. Her steps were heavy, her breath uneven, and her eyes, though tired, still burned with the kind of fear that came from being hunted. She wasn't supposed to be here. No woman of her kind ever wandered this deep into Apache territory and lived long enough to tell the story. Behind her, the fading trail of her footprints told the story of someone who had been running for far too long, running from something, or perhaps from herself. Every sound, every rustle in the distance, made her heart race faster. She could feel the weight of the desert pressing down on her, and for the first time in days she began to wonder if she had already crossed the point of no return. The desert didn't forgive. It took what it wanted, leaving only bones and memories. She had seen it before, the remains of wagons burned and left half buried in the sand, their wheels broken, their people gone. But still she pushed forward, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was the need to escape a truth she could no longer bear to carry. The shadows stretched longer, curling around the rocks like dark fingers. The first chill of night slipped in with the wind, brushing against her face. Her mind whispered to turn back, to find shelter, but she kept walking. She couldn't stop, not now. The voice of her past still echoed in her ears, heavy with shame and regret. She could still see his face, the man she'd trusted, the one who'd promised her safety, then left her to fend for herself when danger came. Her throat tightened as she remembered that last argument. His words had cut her deeper than any wound the desert could give. "You're not the woman I thought you were," he had said, his voice cold, his back already turning away. It wasn't just rejection that broke her, it was the way he said it, as if she'd been something soiled, something no decent man could ever touch again. And so she ran away from his judgment, away from the whispers, away from the life that no longer had a place for her. But the desert wasn't empty. She had heard stories in the towns-tales of the Apache warriors who watched from the hills, silent and unseen. Some said they were ghosts of the earth, moving through the land like shadows. Others said they were devils with eyes like fire, waiting for lost souls to wander into their reach. She had never believed those tales fully. But now, as she felt the weight of unseen eyes on her back, she wasn't so sure anymore. The sound came suddenly, a low thud, like the soft strike of a horse's hoof. Her body froze. The air felt thick. Every sound sharpened. Her eyes darted to the ridge above her, but the last light had faded, and all she could see was the dark outline of the land. She wanted to call out, to say something, but her throat was too dry. Another sound followed, closer this time, a slow crunch of sand beneath a heavy step. Her breath caught. Her hand gripped the small knife she carried in her skirt pocket, though she knew it would do little against whatever was out there. The silence broke again this time, with a faint click, the sound of metal brushing against leather. She turned sharply, her heart pounding, and there he was. He stood only a few paces away, tall as the rocks themselves, his figure outlined by the dim light of the rising moon. The first thing she noticed was his eyes, dark, sharp, and watchful. He didn't move, didn't speak. His chest rose and fell slowly beneath the layers of hide and beads he wore. The wind caught in his long black hair, and for a moment the world seemed to stand still between them. She couldn't tell whether he was a man or a spirit. Every story she'd heard about the Apaches raced through her mind. Her body trembled and her hand slipped from the knife. She wanted to speak, but no words came. Then he moved, just a step closer, his hand lifted slightly, palm open, as if to show he meant no harm. His gaze stayed locked on her face, studying her as if he was trying to read her soul. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the whisper of wind through the sage. She felt her throat tighten again. The fear that had driven her all this way began to mix with something else, something deeper, something she didn't understand. There was power in his presence, but there was no cruelty in his eyes. Still, she couldn't stop herself from trembling. "I'm not pure," she cried suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. The words escaped her before she could stop them, carrying all her pain, her shame, her exhaustion. She didn't know why she said it. Maybe she wanted him to leave, to hate her, to see her the way the others did. But the moment the words left her lips, She wished she could take them back. For a long moment, he didn't move. The wind blew a strand of her hair across her face, and she brushed it away with shaking hands. She couldn't bear to look at him, afraid of what she might see in his expression: disgust, anger, or worse, pity. But when she finally gathered the courage to raise her eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected. He had frozen, his body still as stone, his dark eyes wide not with judgment, but something that looked almost like pain. The muscles in his jaw tightened, and his hand, which had been steady, now dropped slowly to his side. He took a breath, deep and slow, his gaze never leaving hers. The air between them changed, charged with an energy she couldn't name. The night seemed to close in, the sound of the desert fading until only the two of them existed in that moment. Two souls, broken in different ways, staring across the line that divided their worlds. She took a step back, unsure if she should run or stay. Every instinct told her to flee, but something in his eyes held her there. He looked as if her words had struck a wound long buried in his chest. He opened his mouth as if to speak but said nothing. The silence stretched on, heavy and strange, until the cry of a distant coyote broke it apart. The Apache finally turned his head, glancing toward the hills, then back at her. His face was unreadable again, his expression calm, but his eyes burned with something she couldn't decipher. Lifted his hand once more, not in threat, but in warning or maybe invitation. She didn't know which. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. The moonlight painted his figure in silver and shadow, and for a fleeting second she thought she saw a flicker of sorrow pass over his face. Then he stepped closer, slow and careful, as though approaching a frightened animal. Her feet wouldn't move. Her mind screamed to run, but her body stayed rooted to the sand. She didn't understand what he wanted or why he hadn't heard her already. And yet something deep inside whispered that this meeting was no accident, that the desert had brought them together. For a reason neither of them could see yet. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of distant drums from somewhere beyond the ridge. His head turned toward the sound, his eyes narrowing. For a heartbeat, she thought he might leave. But then he looked back at her again, his gaze softer now, almost questioning. She opened her mouth to ask who he was, but before she could speak, the echo of a rifle shot cracked across the valley. The sound shattered the night. A bird flew up from the rocks, and she gasped, ducking instinctively. The Apache's expression hardened instantly. He turned toward the direction of the shot, his whole body tense, his hand reaching for the weapon at his belt. The desert was no longer silent, and as the echo faded into the night, she realized her story and his had only just begun. The echo of the gunshot still hung in the air, rolling off the hills like a storm that refused to pass. The woman's heart pounded so hard it felt like it might break through her ribs. She stared into the dark where the sound had come from, half expecting another shot to follow. But none came. The desert was still again, too still, as if the very earth was holding its breath. The Apache turned sharply, scanning the ridge. His movements were quick but quiet, his eyes narrowing as he listened. Every muscle in his body looked ready to spring into motion. He lifted his hand slightly toward her, a wordless command to stay where she was. She didn't move. Fear and confusion locked her in place. The moonlight cast pale shadows across his face, showing the sharp lines of a man who had lived too long in a world that demanded silence and strength. He stepped forward, crouched, and pressed his fingers into the sand. When he looked up again, his expression was tight. He pointed toward a cluster of rocks nearby, motioning for her to move behind them. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then obeyed, crawling quickly over the uneven ground. The wind picked up again, tugging at her hair, carrying the faint smell of gunpowder. From where she crouched, she watched him move like part of the desert itself, his steps barely disturbing the sand. The fear that had driven her here had shifted into something new, a tense awareness that she was caught. Between two unknown dangers, whoever had fired that shot was out there, watching. And the man who stood between her and the darkness was a stranger whose face gave away nothing. Minutes passed in silence. Her breathing slowed, though her heart still raced. The moon slipped behind a thin veil of cloud, and the world grew dimmer. When the Apache returned, his steps were steady, but his jaw was tight. He glanced toward the distance, then back at her. "There are men," he said quietly, his voice rough, marked with an accent that carried both strength and sorrow. "They follow you." Her eyes widened. "Me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded once. 4, maybe 5, white men. Her chest tightened. She knew who they were. She didn't need to see their faces to be sure. The men from the camp. The ones who had taken everything when her world had fallen apart. The ones who would rather see her dead than free. She swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. "They can't find me," she said softly. "They can't." His eyes studied her for a long moment, unreadable in the shifting light. "You know them." It wasn't a question. She looked away, ashamed. "I do." Her voice broke slightly. "But I don't want to." He watched her for another moment before turning toward the hills. His posture changed, less guarded now, more resolute. "You stay here," he said. "I go see." She reached for him without thinking, catching his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "If they see you, they'll shoot." He looked down at her hand, his dark eyes flicking briefly to her face. "They will not see me." And before she could protest, he slipped away into the shadows. The desert swallowed him whole. She was alone again, the silence pressing down heavy on her chest. Every sound seemed sharper, now the hiss of the wind through dry brush, faint creak of rocks cooling in the night air. Her fingers trembled as she held her knees close, waiting, listening. Time stretched painfully slow. Her thoughts began to drift, pulled back to the path that had led her here. It felt like a lifetime ago, when she had first left the safety of her home, believing the man she followed would keep her safe. He had spoken with smooth confidence, promising her a new beginning in the West, a land of open skies and second chances. She had believed every word, but the West was not made for soft hearts. It had stripped her of everything: her comfort, her trust, her innocence. The man she had trusted turned cold when the hardships came. When the wagon broke down and supplies ran low, his words turned bitter, his eyes cruel. And then came the night he left her behind, vanishing with the others, taking the horses and leaving her to the mercy of the wilderness. She had wandered for days, surviving on luck more than strength. When she stumbled upon the burned wagon near the canyon, she found more horror than hope. The bodies told her what kind of men roamed this land. And she had run, praying the desert would hide her from them. Now, those same men were close again. The thought twisted her stomach into knots. A soft sound made her lift her head. Footsteps, slow, careful, approaching through the sand. Her breath hitched, and she crouched lower, gripping her small knife. The shadow that appeared was tall but familiar. She let out a shaky breath of relief as the Apache emerged from the darkness. He stopped in front of her, his face grim. "They are near," he said. "Half-mile. Maybe less." Her fear returned instantly. "What do they want?" she whispered, though she already knew. His gaze held hers, unblinking. "You," he said simply. She looked away, fighting back tears. "And I can't stay here. If they find me, they'll kill us both." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked toward the horizon, where a faint glow marked the rising moon. "They are not Apache land," he said quietly. "They will not walk far into it. I will take you to the hills. There you hide until morning." She hesitated, unsure whether to trust him, but trust was all she had left. She nodded slowly. He led the way, moving quickly but silently, his presence steady and sure. She followed as best she could, though her legs ached and her breath came in short bursts. The desert stretched endlessly around them, and yet he moved with purpose, as if he knew every rock and shadow by heart. After a while, they reached a narrow passage between two ridges. The moonlight spilled over the rocks, revealing a small opening that led to a hollow space beneath the cliff. He motioned for her to enter. "It is safe here," he said. "They cannot see from the trail." She stepped inside, the ground cool beneath her bare feet. The space was small but dry, shielded from the wind. When he joined her, the narrowness of the place brought them close enough for her to hear the steady rhythm of his breathing. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them carried weight in spoken questions, unspoken fears. "Why are you helping me?" she asked finally, her voice quiet but steady. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his words were low. "You walk alone in my land," he said. "You are hunted. I do not leave the hunted to die." She studied him, trying to understand the man behind those words. There was something in his tone that hinted at his own scars, something deep and heavy that had shaped him long before this night. "I didn't mean to come here," she said softly. "I was just trying to survive." He nodded once, still watching the desert beyond the opening. Survival brings many to the wrong place. They fell silent again. She could hear the faint crackle of dry grass outside, the whisper of wind moving through the canyon. The tension between them lingered, fragile but real. Then, far off, the sound of voices carried through the night. Men's voices, angry, shouting, searching. She stiffened. The Apache's head turned sharply, his hand going to the weapon at his side. He glanced toward her. "They come closer," he said. "Behind the rock. Do not speak." Her heart pounded as she crouched lower, trying to make herself small. The voices grew louder for a few moments, then faded again as the men moved further down the ridge. The Apache waited in silence, every muscle tense, listening until the desert swallowed the sound. Only then did he relax slightly, exhaling a quiet breath. She dared to look up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and fear. "Thank you," she whispered. He turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "You are not safe yet," he said. "They will come again. They do not stop." His words sent a chill down her spine. Outside, the night deepened, wrapping the land in darkness. The moon climbed higher, painting the rocks in silver light. The two of them sat in silence, separated by the thin line between trust and danger. And somewhere in the distance, the faint crack of another gun echoed across the valley, reminding them both that the past was not done chasing either of them. The cold night air pressed heavy around them. The silence inside the rocky hollow was filled only by the sound of the woman's unsteady breathing. The Apache sat near the entrance, his back against the stone, his eyes fixed on the dark land beyond. The faint glow of the moonlight touched the sharp line of his cheek, making him look carved from the same rock that surrounded them. He had not spoken since the last gunshot echoed across the desert, but his stillness carried the weight of a man who could hear what others could not. The woman hugged her knees, shivering, even though the air was not as cold as the fear that clung to her. The fire in her heart that once came from anger had softened into something quieter, a mix of exhaustion and unease. She had spent her life being judged by men who only saw what they wanted to see. But this man, this stranger, hadn't looked at her with disgust or pity, and that confused her more than anything else. She wanted to ask his name, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't know if speaking would break the fragile peace between them. So, instead, she whispered, "Will they come back tonight?" His head turned slightly, but his eyes stayed on the horizon. "Yes," he said. "Men like that do not sleep when they hunt." Something in his tone made her shiver again. She watched him quietly, trying to read his expression, but he remained unreadable, his features calm, his movements measured. He seemed like someone who had lived too long in a world where silence was survival. Finally, she found her voice again. "You knew they were close before I even heard them." "How?" He shifted slightly, his gaze still steady on the night. "I know this land," he said. "It speaks if you listen. The sand, the wind, even the animals, they tell when something is wrong." She wanted to believe that. Maybe it was true. The desert had its own language, one she had never learned. "And what does it say now?" she asked softly. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "It says danger is not far." Her stomach nodded. The fear she had been trying to hold down rose again. "They will not," he interrupted firmly. "You are safe for now." But even as he said it, there was something in his eyes that told her he didn't fully believe it himself. The hours dragged slowly. She tried to rest, but sleep refused to come. Each time her eyes closed, she saw flashes of faces, angry, familiar, cruel. The men chasing her were not strangers. They were the same men she had once traveled with, the ones who had laughed by the fire, who had promised to protect her. But when greed and jealousy took hold, they had turned on her, blaming her for what went wrong, for every loss, every failure. Now they hunted her to silence the past. She turned her head toward the Apache. "Why would they come after me? I have nothing." He looked at her then, really looked at her, his dark eyes narrowing slightly. "You know something?" he said quietly. "Or you saw something they cannot let you tell? She hesitated, her fingers digging into the hem of her dress. "There was gold," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the mountains near Santa Fe, they found it before the storm hit. But they killed the man who showed them where it was. I ran before they could decide what to do with me. I thought they'd let me go. But now," her voice broke, "now they wanted her gone for good." The Apache was silent for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. "That is why they come. Gold makes men blind. They will not stop." Her throat tightened. "Then what about you? Are you out here?" He didn't answer at first. His eyes drifted toward the moonlit ridge as if searching for something long lost. "This is my land," he said at last.
Yeah, my people once walked here before the soldiers came. They took our homes, our water, our horses. We walk where they think no one lives."
She studied him in the dim light. There was a deep sadness in his voice, the kind that came from carrying the weight of more than one lifetime. "Do you live alone?" she asked carefully. He nodded. "My people are scattered, some taken, some gone. The ones who stay do not trust the white man's world." The quiet stretched between them again. She wanted to speak, to say she was sorry, but the words felt empty in her mouth. What comfort could she offer a man whose world had been stolen? A sudden sound broke the silence, faint rustle outside the hollow, then a crack of dry twigs. The Apache was on his feet instantly, moving like a shadow, his weapon drawn. He motioned for her to stay still. Her breath caught as she listened. The sound came again, closer this time, a shuffle of boots against stone. She pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from gasping. He stepped toward the opening, crouched low, and disappeared outside. The silence that followed was unbearable. She waited, heart pounding, counting each second. Then came a muffled sound, like a struggle. A grunt. Thud. Her body froze. The next moment, the Apache reappeared, dragging a man by the collar. The stranger was one of the pursuers, his face smeared with dust, his gun half buried in sand. He looked terrified. The woman's stomach twisted as she recognized him. "Well," she whispered. The Apache threw him to the ground. "He was scouting," he said simply. Will's eyes darted between them. "You don't understand," he sputtered. "She's trouble. She's lying to you." The Apache didn't answer. He stood tall over him, his weapon steady. The man looked desperate now. She took something that wasn't hers. "You think you're saving her? But she's poison. She'll get you killed just like the others." "Stop," she said sharply, her voice shaking. "You're the one who killed for that gold. You're the one who left me to die." Will sneered. "You think anyone would believe you? You're not pure. You never were. You think this savage will care what you say when he learns the truth?" The Apache's eyes flicked toward her at the word, his jaw tightening slightly, but he said nothing. Instead, he stepped forward and struck the man's weapon from his reach with a swift motion. "Go," the Apache said coldly. "Tell the others the desert will bury them if they follow." Will hesitated, glaring at the woman one last time before stumbling away into the darkness. When he was gone, she turned toward the Apache, her body trembling. "You should have let him go sooner," she said weakly. "Now they'll come harder." "They would come anyway," he said. Psst. She wanted to believe that, but deep down she knew Will's kind didn't stop until they had what they wanted. The Apache returned to his spot near the entrance, his face calm again, though she could see the tension in his shoulders. The moonlight caught the faint scars that ran down his arm, signs of battles long past. She sat in silence, her thoughts heavy. She wanted to ask what he thought of what Will had said about her being not pure, but something inside her stopped her. Maybe because she feared the answer. Hours passed, and the first hint of dawn began to touch the edge of the horizon. The pale blue light crept slowly across the desert, revealing the endless stretch of land that seemed to go on forever. The Apache rose and stepped outside, scanning the distance. The woman followed, staying close behind. The world looked peaceful in the soft morning light, but she knew it was a lie. Somewhere out there, men with guns were still searching. Somewhere, greed was leading them straight toward this fragile safety. The Apache turned to her. "We move when the sun rises," he said. "They will not stop until they find you, and the desert will not hide us forever." She nodded, her voice quiet. "Where will we go?" He looked toward the mountains far to the north. "To the place of the red stones," he said. "Few men dare to walk there. It is sacred." As the first rays of sunlight touched the sand, a new day began, but it brought no peace. The woman knew the danger was far from over, and as they stood together in the vast silence of the desert, the weight of what was coming pressed heavy on both of them. Behind them, the faint sound of distant hoofbeats drifted through the morning air, echoing across the empty land like a promise of what waited just beyond the horizon. The sun had barely cleared the jagged horizon when they began moving again. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a harsh, unyielding landscape that demanded respect. Each step was measured, deliberate, as the woman struggled to keep pace with the Apache's long, sure strides. Her legs ached, her lungs burned, but she forced herself to continue. There was no turning back now. The desert was alive in ways she could never have imagined. Every whisper of wind, every shifting shadow, every distant call of a hawk seemed to speak to him, and through him, to her. She tried to listen, tried to understand, but the language of the land was foreign to her. All she could do was follow and hope that his instincts would be enough to keep them both alive. Hours passed in silence. The wind carried the scent of dry earth and sage, sharp and acrid. The woman's mind wandered, but fear kept her thoughts taut. She thought of the men who pursued Hertha, greed in their eyes, the ruthlessness in their hands. She knew they would not stop until they had what they came for, and that knowledge sat heavy in her chest. The Apache led her along a narrow ridge, the terrain dropping steeply on either side. The wind whipped around them, tugging at her dress and hair, carrying dust and grit into her eyes. She squinted, struggling to see the path ahead. He moved ahead of her, scanning the horizon, listening, every movement precise and silent. "You have survived long," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "Longer than most would in your place." She shook her head. "I've only run. I don't know how to survive." His gaze flicked back toward her, sharp and assessing. "Running is not weakness," he said. "It is wisdom. But running alone is dangerous. You would have died if I had not been here." She swallowed hard, feeling a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. She had grown up believing she needed no one, that self-reliance would protect her. Now she realized how naive she had been. The ridge began to narrow, and the rocks grew taller and more jagged. Shadows stretched long across the ground, and the sun's glare bounced harshly off the stone. "Ch!" She stumbled, catching herself on a jagged outcrop. The Apache turned back, his expression calm but watchful. "You must be careful," he said. "One wrong step, and the desert takes more than pride." She nodded, swallowing her fear. Every step felt like walking a line between life and death. And as the ridge gave way to a steep slope leading down into a canyon, the tension coiled tighter in her chest. When they reached the canyon floor, the landscape changed. The walls rose high around them, casting long shadows, the path ahead narrow and winding. The desert felt heavier here, quieter, as if it was holding its breath. She stayed close to him, sensing that danger was not far behind. He stopped abruptly, lifting a hand to signal silence. Her heart jumped. She followed his gaze and saw movement on a distant ridge, figures moving slowly, methodically, searching. Men, guns slung over shoulders, eyes scanning the land. "They are close," he whispered. "They know we are here." Her stomach twisted. She had hoped that the night had hidden them, that the morning light would give them cover. But the men were persistent, skilled, relentless. They would not stop until they found her. "Can we outrun them?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. He shook his head slightly. "Not in a straight path, but the canyon hides many turns. If we are careful, we may mislead them." She clung to the words, though her body shook with fear. She realized how small and fragile she felt in the vastness of the desert, how dependent she had become on this stranger who moved like the land itself. Hours passed as they wound their way through the canyon. Every sound, every crack of stone, every rustle of brush made her jump. She learned quickly to move silently, to follow his lead, to trust the instincts he had honed over a lifetime. At one point, the Apache stopped again, crouching low behind a boulder. He gestured for her to do the same. She pressed herself against the rock, holding her breath. "They are near," he murmured. "2 men ahead, coming down the pass. They will not see us if we wait." She nodded, though her hands trembled. The desert seemed to close in around them, the narrow canyon walls echoing every sound. Her pulse raced. Every instinct screamed that they could be discovered at any moment. The men passed by, oblivious to their presence. She exhaled slowly when the sounds faded. The Apache remained still, his eyes scanning the shadows, every muscle coiled. "You are skilled," she said softly. He looked at her briefly. "Learn quickly, or you die." The words were blunt, but she felt the weight of truth in them. I had already learned that the desert rewarded caution, patience, and respect. Every mistake could cost more than just pride. As the day wore on, the canyon began to widen. They reached a small stream, the only water they had seen in hours. She knelt to drink, the cold water burning her throat, but it gave her strength. The Apache did not drink, merely observing the terrain, listening to the sounds of the desert around them. "You must rest," he said. "The night comes soon. The men will use darkness to their advantage. You must be ready." She nodded, though her body screamed with exhaustion. She leaned back against the rocks, allowing herself a brief moment of reprieve, but her mind would not rest. Thoughts of the men hunting her, of the gold that had drawn them here, of the danger she had run from and now ran with, refused to leave. As the sun dipped low, painting the canyon walls in red and gold, the Apache began to move again. He led her up a narrow slope, toward a series of cliffs that jutted out like teeth from the earth. The path was treacherous, but it offered a vantage point, a place to see danger before it came. They paused at the top, the wind strong and biting. She looked down at the canyon floor, where shadows stretched long, and she saw movement. More men. They were methodical, searching every turn, scanning every ridge. She felt a cold fear grip her heart. "They will find us soon," she whispered. He nodded. "Perhaps. But we will make them pay for every step they take." She looked at him, trying to understand. His words were not about revenge. They were about survival, about the harsh justice the desert demanded. She realized then that he lived by rules she had never known, rules shaped by a land that gave nothing freely. The wind carried a faint sound of hoofbeats. Her pulse quickened. She scanned the horizon, seeing figures moving faster now, riding toward them. The Apache stepped in front of her, his stance protective, his eyes sharp. "They are coming," he said. She swallowed hard. Every muscle in her body tensed. She had hoped to outrun them, to hide, to survive. But now she saw the limits of hope. The desert offered refuge, but it was not infinite. The men pursuing her were relentless, skilled, and desperate. She looked at the Apache, studying his face in the fading light. He was calm, unflinching, but she could see the tension beneath the surface, the readiness for violence if it came. He was a giant of a man, a protector shaped by the land, and yet she sensed even he could not control every outcome. The riders drew closer, their voices carrying over the canyon, shouting, urging one another. The woman crouched low, pressing herself against the rocks. Her hands shook as she clutched her knife, but she knew it would not save her if they were discovered. It's only strategy. Only the instincts of the man beside her could give her a chance. The Apache moved silently, positioning himself between her and the approaching threat. His eyes locked on the riders, measuring, calculating. She could feel the electricity of the moment, the tension that comes when life hangs by a thread. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying the sound of hooves in a different direction. The riders paused, uncertain, scanning the cliffs. She held her breath, her chest tight. The next moments would decide everything. And then the first gunshot rang out, cutting through the canyon like a scream. She screamed instinctively, pressed closer to the rock, and the Apache moved with lightning speed. The desert around them erupted into chaos, dust and stones scattering with the shots. Her heart pounded so violently she thought it might burst. They were trapped in the canyon, the walls echoing the sound of pursuit. Every instinct screamed danger, every shadow a threat. She looked at him, fear and awe mingling in her eyes. He did not flinch, did not hesitate. His eyes were like fire, unyielding, a promise of protection that might or might not be enough. The sound of more hoofbeats and shouting drew closer. The desert seemed to close in, the walls of the canyon pressing down, the sun slipping behind clouds, casting shadows that hid nothing and revealed everything. She realized in that moment that survival would not be enough. They would have to fight, to outsmart, to endure. And as the Apache stood ready, his body coiled like a spring. She understood that the climax of their struggle was about to arrive. The desert held its breath, and so did she. Knowing that the coming moments would change everything and nothing would ever be the same, the canyon seemed to explode with noise gunfire, shouting, and the pounding of hooves echoing off the stone walls. The woman pressed herself against the jagged rocks, her hands trembling. The small knife in her grip, now feeling almost laughably inadequate. She watched the Apache move like a shadow, precise and deadly, every step calculated, every movement designed to protect and survive. Fear and awe fought within her chest. She had never seen anyone move like him, his presence a force of nature as raw as the desert itself. A rider surged around a bend, shouting, raising his weapon. The Apache was already there, intercepting with a speed that made her gasp. The man crashed against the rocks with a grunt, rolling to the ground. The next rider hesitated, and in that pause, the Apache's voice cut out a low, commanding growlland. The rider froze in place, fear written across his face. She didn't know if it was the desert, the man beside her, or the sheer audacity of the moment. But the hunters faltered. Their organized pursuit began to crumble. The woman felt the tight coil of terror in her chest loosen slightly, placed by a sharp awareness of how close they had come to death, and how much the Apache had protected her. The fight seemed to last an eternity, yet in truth, it was only minutes. When the last man fled, stumbling back along the ridge, she realized the canyon had grown quiet again. Only the wind whispered over the rocks. The pounding of her own heart seemed deafening as she tried to catch her breath. The Apache stood over her, his eyes scanning the empty path, his weapon lowered, but still ready. "You are safe," he said finally, his voice quiet now, though there was no softness. "For now." She looked at him, the weight of exhaustion pulling her down. Her body ached, her hands shook, and yet there was a strange clarity in her mind. She had survived, not by luck, not by chance, but because of courage, instinct, and the man who had guided her through the desert like a living shadow. "Thank you," she whispered, voice rough. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." He studied her briefly, his expression unreadable. "You repay me by living," he said, "by learning from this land, from its dangers. By understanding that survival requires more than strength, it requires patience, respect, and trust." She nodded slowly, taking in his words. They were heavy with truth, simple and unyielding like the land itself. She had come into the desert believing she had lost everything, yet she had found something unexpected, a chance to endure, a chance to understand, and a person whose presence demanded respect without asking for it. For hours, they stayed in the canyon, catching their breath, moving carefully among the rocks, wary of any further threats. As the sun climbed higher, the heat of the day pressed down, sharp and unrelenting. She learned quickly that the desert required vigilance, that even a moment's distraction could be fatal. But the Apache was patient, teaching her through example, showing her when to move, when to pause, and when to watch. They eventually reached a narrow path leading to a series of red stone cliffs. The landscape was breathtaking, the sun casting deep shadows across the jagged surfaces, painting them in shades of copper and gold. She paused for a moment, letting herself drink in the sight. It was the first time in days she had felt awe instead of terror, and it filled her with a quiet hope. "This is the place you spoke of," she said softly. He nodded, stepping forward to a small ledge overlooking the valley below. "Few men come here," he said. "It is sacred. Those who respect it are safe. Those who do not learn the consequences." She looked down at the valley, understanding immediately. The canyon walls and cliffs created a natural fortress, one that gave them both cover and advantage. The hunters could not easily follow without exposing themselves. It was a place where the desert itself became an ally, where survival and strategy intertwined. They moved carefully along the ledge, her steps light, her senses sharp. She had grown in the desert, not only in skill, but in awareness, understanding the rhythms and signals of the land. She realized now that the fear that had driven her was no longer the only thing guiding her, was observation, patience, and the steady presence of the Apache. As they paused atop the cliffs, he finally spoke of the gold she had run from. "It is dangerous," he said. "Greed blinds men, makes them careless. You were lucky to escape. Most would have been killed." She nodded, feeling the weight of her past mistakes. "I ran because I feared them, because I didn't know who to trust. I thought no one could protect me." "You trusted the wrong people," he said, eyes darkening slightly. but you are learning. That is what matters. She realized in that moment that she had grown in ways she had never imagined. Fear had taught her caution, desperation had taught her ingenuity, and the Apache had shown her strength tempered by knowledge. She no longer felt entirely helpless. Hours passed as they rested, hidden among the red cliffs. The hunters had not followed, and the silence of the desert returned, deep and contemplative. The woman allowed herself a moment to breathe, to reflect on how close she had come to death and how much had changed in her understanding of survival, trust, and resilience. As the day wore on, the Apache spoke less, but she watched him carefully. She realized he was not just protecting her physically, he was guiding her toward understanding, toward recognizing her own strength. The desert had been her adversary, but in the presence of someone who understood it, she had learned its lessons. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the red cliffs in fiery shades. They moved again, descending carefully along a hidden path. Each step required focus, balance, and patience. She had never imagined the desert could be both beautiful and deadly. But now she understood that every rock, every shadow, every whisper of wind was a teacher. They finally reached a sheltered alcove at the base of the cliffs, a place with water and shade, hidden from any prying eyes. The woman knelt by the stream, cupping the cool water in her hands. She drank deeply, feeling life flow back into her, feeling the desert's harshness soften into something protective and sustaining. The Apache remained nearby, silent but watchful. He scanned the horizon, listening to the sounds of the desert, reading the land as if it were an open book. She watched him, realizing that he had become more than a protector. He was a guide, a teacher, a figure who embodied the spirit of the land. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "I understand now. I understand what it means to survive, to endure. And I understand that running is not Shemit, is wisdom." He looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the fading sunlight. "Yes," he said, "and now you must decide what to do with that wisdom. The desert has taught you much, but life outside it will test you further. Trust, patience, and strength will guide you, but only if you carry them with you." She nodded, feeling a sense of calm she had not known in weeks. The past would always be with her, the mistakes and losses she had endured, but she understood that survival was about more than avoiding death. It was about learning, growing, and finding the courage to face the unknown. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the cliffs, she realized the desert was no longer an enemy. It was a place of truth, a place that revealed what mattered most: courage, patience, trust, and the quiet strength that comes from facing the impossible and living to tell the story. The Apache finally spoke one last time, his voice low and certain. "Rest now. You've earned it. Tomorrow the desert will continue to test you, but for tonight you are safe." She allowed herself to lean back against the stone, feeling the coolness of the rock against her skin. She thought of the men who had chased her, of the dangers that would always exist, and of the choices she would face in the days to come. And yet, for the first time in a long while, she felt something she had not believed she would ever feel again: hope. The desert wind whispered through the cliffs, carrying the faint scent of sage and earth. And in that moment, she realized she had found more than survival. She had found understanding, resilience, and the knowledge that even in the harshest places, courage could endure. The Apache stood silently at her side, a guardian, a teacher, and a friend. Together, they watched the first stars appear above the red cliffs, the night settling over the desert like a protective shroud. The woman closed her eyes for a moment, letting the silence and the stillness fill her, feeling the strength that came not from running or hiding, but from facing the world with eyes wide open and heart unyielding. The desert had tested her, and she had survived. And in that survival, she had found the beginning of something stronger than fear. She had found the possibility of a life shaped by courage, wisdom, and the unbreakable bond forged in the heart of the wild. The night stretched on, calm and eternal, as she sat with the Apache by the stream, knowing that though dangers might return, the lessons of the desert would stay with her forever, guiding her through whatever lay ahead.